I Will Make You Proud by Wheredoesshego. Trigger warning. This fic includes talk of abuse, talk of suicide, and potential sexual content. Please read with care. Chapter 8. Make Me Proud, Son. Hermione, May 2006. Blaise held Hermione's hair back as she vomited, her stomach contracting over and over again until the tiled floor, splashing onto her feet and his. The coffee she had sipped earlier refusing to stay in her stomach. She squeezed her eyes tightly shut, trying to block out what she had just seen. He had been so small, so small. Hermione couldn't stop her mind's eye from replaying the image of Draco's little body crumpled against the side table. His fingers, how tiny they had been as he drew them back from his head, crimson with blood. His nose broken, the blood running over those rosy little boy cheeks. The tears that fell so freely from his eyes. Hermione couldn't bear it. In all the violence she had seen in her life, she'd never seen a child hurt in such a degrading and brutal way. And it had been by his own father. Thinking about the added humiliation of being made to lick the floor of the manor caused another wave of sickness to come over her. She was sweating, tears running over her own cheeks once her stomach had finally stopped clenching and she could stand up. Blaise was now leaning against the pensive, a hand over his eyes. He flicked his wand at the mess and motioned for her to come to him. He put an arm around her shoulder, allowing her to collapse limply against his side, and smoothed her hair back, waiting for her to calm down. "Did you know, Blaise?" she asked. "When you saw him as a child, did you see the injuries on him?" Blaise shook his head. His brown eyes were dark, haunted by Malfoy's memories as well as his own. "No. I truly had no idea it started when he was that small, Hermione. We were kids. I didn't see him often, and I wouldn't have known what to look for." "But you knew as he got older?" Blaise looked embarrassed. There were some things he said inadvertently over the years, and once, I think it was second year, he came back from home visit with a huge bruise along his side, but he said he'd fallen off his broom. Blaise shook his head, eyes staring as he thought back. "I had no idea it was like that. He was always so proud to be a Malfoy. So much like his father, I thought he was doted on. I thought his parents adored him." "We all did," Hermione said bitterly. "Maybe it was a one-off. Something had gone wrong, maybe to trigger Lucius. Maybe he just snapped that day and regretted it. It could be the reason Malfoy left this particular memory." A kind of sickly hope had sprung up in Hermione. She looked at the vials. The next one was from 1987. "Shall we look at this one?" Blaise looked hesitant. "Are you sure?" "It's our job, Blaise. We need to look at all of them, no matter how difficult it is." He nodded, looking slightly drained already. "Let's get this done." Blaise squeezed Hermione's hand as she poured the memory in, and they dipped their heads again down into the shimmering liquid. Back at the manor. Such a hateful place, Hermione thought, looking around again at the large windows, the heavy drapes, and the intricately carved woodwork. It was just so dark. Draco was 7 now. only slightly older in years, but the change in him outwardly was marked. Already she could see signs of the stiff, closed-off Malfoy she had known from school. In the memory, he stalked through the manor halls, light on his feet, lithe and wary. He didn't clatter through like he did in the last memory. He moved like a cat. He was taller, his hair slightly longer and less wild. He was wearing what looked like a pair of dark wool shorts, tweed again. His shirt was dark green, black braces over his shoulders. His socks were pushed down to his calves, bunched at the top of the black hobnail boots on his feet. He was still sun-kissed, but his eyes didn't hold the light the way they had previously. He looked dimmer, sadder. No rosy cheeks and gleeful little boy's smile. Hermione could see that he had deep purple finger marks across his right wrist, and his bottom lip was split, only half healed. He massaged the bruised wrist with his other hand, absently as he walked. 7-year-old Draco's attention had been caught by a noise inside the room. He was almost past the gap in the door when he heard it and doubled back on himself, stopping and peeking in at the door. He watched for a long moment, his muscles tense, fingers tight on the door handle and his eyes pressed to the gap. Hermione and Blaise couldn't see what he was watching. Suddenly, Draco took a long step back from the door. His face changed, panic setting into his features. In an instant, he had turned on the heel of his boot and he was running, sprinting down the long hallway. The door of the room he had been peering into was yanked forcibly back, and Lucius Malfoy appeared in the hallway. His hair was messy. He wasn't wearing robes, just trousers and a dress shirt untucked at the waist. His feet were bare. Hermione had never seen Lucius Malfoy without his expensive robes and his wand encased within his cane. He was flustered, his icy demeanor fallen away, replaced with a hot, black rage. He now ran, too, turning his head, clearly looking for Draco. Hermione wanted to cover her eyes. She willed the chase in, for Draco to hide, for Lucius not to find him. But, of course, he did. Hermione had to force herself to watch. This was evidence. She couldn't close her eyes against the images of the memory. Lucius had found Draco in what looked like an unused room. Draco had tried to climb underneath a chaise that was covered with a dust sheet, but his father caught him by the ankle and dragged him out. Draco was panicking, apologizing, scrambling at the wooden floor. Hermione heard Blaise swear at the sound of the child's nails dragging across the wood. She watched as he dug them in, fingers clawed, scrabbling to be free from his father's vice-like grip, his nails tearing away from the beds, blood streaking the floor. Hermione didn't know how Draco had survived the beating his father gave him. It was unbearable to watch. She closed her eyes against the dull thuds, the sound of Malfoy crying, begging his father to stop, and worst of all, his small voice calling out for a mother that didn't come. Lucius Malfoy did not stop until there was a certain noise, a dull crack. Draco's sobs suddenly turned into a shriek, an anguished, pain-filled shriek. He put a hand up to his arm near his shoulder and he screamed, rolling on the ground. Lucius stopped his attack and watched his son for a moment, appearing to debate what to do. Eventually, he seemed to realize that he had gone far enough. He sneered down at Draco, the icy poison back in his voice again. "You stay in here. Clean yourself up. If you dare even think about telling your mother what you saw there, boy, I'll devour you." And he marched out, blonde hair flying behind him. Draco was left on the floor of the room, bleeding. Hermione and Blaise watched him try to get up and collapse back down, crying into the wood. They watched his tears darken the grain, blood dribbling from between his lips. He kept trying. After a time, Draco put one hand on the ground. The other was still holding his shoulder, and they watched him finally struggle to a sitting position, looking around him, biting at a ragged nail. Hermione desperately wanted to go to him, to comfort him, to hold him and wipe the blood from his small, innocent face. She wondered what he could have possibly seen in that room to make his father react so violently. She thought of Draco Malfoy as an adult, the images of him in the prophet as he left the manor for the last time, the blood running down his face again. This time his father's blood rather than his own, and she thought she could finally understand it. Lucius Malfoy deserved to pay for what he had done to his helpless son. Draco Malfoy had been a monster, yes, but so had his father. Watching Draco's suffering, she realized he hadn't become one through choice. He was Frankenstein's monster all along. Then they watched him eventually settle back down onto the floor, curled in on himself, his chest heaving. He held his shoulder in one hand, swiped at his bloody nose with the other, and then relaxed his battered body onto the wood. They watched as the little boy began to drift off into sleep. He tucked his little legs underneath him, his socks still pushed down to his boots, his shorts and his shirt torn. Hermione could barely believe her eyes when the 7-year-old Draco's lip curved up as he lay there, a small bloody smile. She wondered what he could have possibly found to keep him hopeful in this tragic, difficult life. She and Blaise were silent as they withdrew from the memory. She heard Blaise sniffle a few times, and she kept her eyes off of him, letting him have his moment of grief. Instead, she busied herself siphoning the memory back and putting the two they had watched into the evidence drawer. She made notes on what they had seen, a sick feeling in her gut at having to go through them again. She thought back to the hippogriff once more, about the medical scroll bearing Draco Malfoy's outline, his plethora of injuries lit up in various colors, different ages, different severities. She knew now that Buckbeak had kicked him in the shoulder his own father had broken. She felt a sick rage as she thought of the stink Lucius Malfoy had kicked up about Draco's injury. How he had insisted on Buckbeak's execution, even though he knew he had done it himself. She felt the red-hot flush of shame as she remembered them all laughing at Malfoy, rolling on the ground, then being carried away by Hagrid. He must have been in agony to let his pain show in front of them all. To be so vulnerable, she realized. Blaise seemed to have gathered himself now and looked at his watch. "We've got an hour left. Are you up to watch another?" Hermione nodded. She needed to. She needed to see more of Malfoy, to understand him more. Just those two memories had altered what she thought she had known about him, that he was spoiled, pampered, and had lived a gilded life. She was blindsided by how well he had hidden it. Hermione wondered about Narcissa. Where had she been in all of this? She seemed to make some weak attempts to defend him in the first memory, although she had looked scared also. Hermione wondered whether Narcissa would be capable of an interview. She had plenty of questions for that woman. Blaise looked through the vials and selected the next one. September 1991, the year they all started at Hogwarts. At least this one hopefully won't be in the manor, he muttered. She nodded, still feeling lightheaded. He gave her a small, encouraging smile, just a slight shift of the corner of his mouth. He looked pallid. Hermione remembered that this had been his friend. His guilt must be horrendous. Blaise tipped it in, and they sighed with relief as they watched the memory shimmer. It wasn't in the manor. Hermione took a deep breath before dipping her head in. She reached for Blaise's fingers again, a grip on something solid as she felt herself fall into the memory. Malfoy was stood on a platform 9 3/4, flanked by Lucius and Narcissa. He looked small, stood in between them. His hair shone, his Hogwarts robes were immaculate, his dragon skin shoes polished to perfection. Hermione realized that you had to look very closely to see the slight tremor in his hands that clenched and unclenched by his side, the signet ring glinting in the fluorescent light of the station. He looked outwardly to be relaxed, confident. His mother fussed over him, dusting off his shoulders and straightening his collar. His jaw tensed and he looked away as she brought her face close to his, smoothing down his hair. His chest rose and fell, his face a mask of cool indifference. Eventually, her motherly image firmly in place, Narcissa left him alone and moved back to stand next to Lucius again. She stepped from foot to foot, her own nerves apparent. Hermione thought she looked to all intents and purposes like a mother who was just anxious to let her young son out of her sight for the first time. Lucius was still. He was the only one of them who didn't seem nervous. Instead, he seemed to be on high alert, scanning the station, looking for someone. He clearly hadn't seen whatever he was looking for, as he now lifted his cane and tapped it sharply onto Draco's shoulder, who jumped like a gun had gone off. Lucius leaned in, his mouth close to Draco's ear. "Harry Potter," he hissed. Messy hair, green eyes, glasses, a scar on his forehead. "You find that boy and you befriend him. Do you hear? He is the key." One hand gripped Draco's shoulder tightly as he spoke, digging in. "This is your first job. You will not let me down." Draco didn't respond, but his gray eyes widened. He swept them around the station. "You know what will happen to you if you fail." Another spiteful hiss into the boy's ear. Hermione could hear the venom in Lucius's voice from where she stood. Draco's knees seemed to collapse inward, slightly before he quickly caught himself. He turned to look at his father, gray eyes huge in his face. "I won't let you down, Father," he said, affecting an air of confidence. His eyes searched Lucius's. "I'll befriend him, get close to him. I'll tell you everything he does." "You'd better." The command was dripping in spite. Lucius stood back now and looked down at Draco, giving him a sickly smile. Hermione guessed it was intended to look loving for the benefit of everyone watching. She watched Draco's Adam's apple bob. The Hogwarts Express finally arrived, screaming onto the platform. Narcissa positively sagged with relief. Draco's eyes lit up. He picked up his case, his owl. She watched Narcissa hug him to her, his arms stiff by his side. She cooed, she kissed him, she stroked his face. Draco smiled and avoided her eyes, pulling gently away. He finally walked towards the train, his pace urgent. As he stepped on, Lucius called out, loud and obnoxious, clearly intending everyone to hear. Good luck, son. I'm sure you will make me proud. Hermione couldn't see Draco's expression as he stepped onto the train. The memory jumped now to the inside of the train. She heard Blaise's sharp intake of breath next to her as he saw himself and Theodore Nott come bounding into view. Malfoy, Blaise yelled, jumping on him, hands on shoulders. Come on, we've got a seat for you. Malfoy nodded and followed behind Theo, who was bringing up the rear down the aisle, the blurred outline of his parents passing the window as the train left the station. She watched the relief dance across his face as their image disappeared from view. The first real smile she'd ever seen from him as he entered the booth containing Pansy, Crabbe, and Goyle, coming in behind Theo and Blaise. He dropped his things to the floor and grinned at Pansy, who was looking at him like he was made of gold. Hiya, Pants, he said simply. She smiled wildly, glowing under his gaze. Draco sat for only a moment before jumping up again. Toilet, he offered, and stood quickly out of the booth and down the aisle. His movements were hurried. He seemed to be barely holding on to control of himself. He reached the toilet door, and another wizard Hermione recognized, an 11-year-old Dean Thomas, even by the back of his head, approached at the same time as him. Draco didn't hesitate for a second, didn't break stride as he put two hands out and shoved Dean hard away from the toilet door. Dean sprawled against the wall, shock evident on his face. I was here first. Watch where you're going, idiot, Malfoy spat out. Dean had no time to recover himself before the toilet door slammed shut. On the inside, Draco slid down onto the floor of the toilet, back to the door. His chest was heaving, his breath erratic, wheezing loudly, chest contracting rapidly in and out, one hand fisting through his hair, the other pressed to his heart. Hermione watched his stomach rise and fall, his feet sliding out in front of him. His shoulders hitched, his eyes were wide. Draco was having a panic attack, she realized. She watched him for a few moments, feeling panic stir in her own chest. She saw him struggle to catch his breath. But before long, she became aware that he was calming, his breath gradually evening out, his inhales and exhales measured. She watched his eyes begin to go blank. He was occluding, Hermione realized. The glassy silver slowly changed from stormy to cloudy. His breathing slowed, his chest steeled. He allowed his hands to fall limply to the ground. It was almost frightening, the way the light dimmed and went out of his eyes like he died there on the toilet floor. He sat there, disappeared into himself, ignoring the polite knocks that slowly turned frantic. Hermione recognized Neville's muffled voice coming from outside the door, shouting that he was about to wet himself. After a time, Draco stood, a picture of calm benevolence on his face now. He opened the door and looked Neville up and down before yanking hard on his tie, bringing his face close to his forehead pressed against Neville's. You'll wait your fucking turn next time, he drawled, releasing the tie, leaving a very flustered Neville behind him as he stalked back down the aisle. Hermione watched, marveled at the control Draco now had over himself for such a young boy. His occlusion ability was far beyond what she had ever seen in someone so young. He moved purposefully, elegantly, his nose in the air. She gasped as she suddenly saw her younger self appear in the memory. Well, initially she just saw her bushy hair. She was coming towards Malfoy down the aisle. She couldn't even remember this, had no memory of it happening. In the memory, Hermione glanced up at Malfoy, who was a good head taller than her. He stopped dead and looked down his nose at her. Oh, sorry, she said, slightly breathless, flattening herself to the seats to give him room. Malfoy's eyes were on hers, his gray meeting her brown, and holding them for only a moment before he wordlessly passed her. She saw herself carry on down the aisle, but Malfoy had stopped where he was. He turned and watched her go. Something like a light dancing in the cold, flat gray of his eyes for a brief second. He stood a moment more, his eyes on her fuzzy head as it bobbed away through to the next carriage. Then he turned, his eyes blank again, and walked back to his friends in his cabin. She and Blaise watched him now, sitting quietly in the cabin amongst the rowdiness of the train. He didn't say much, a few sarcastic comments here and there, dropped in at opportune moments. His eyes studied everyone else closely, though. He seemed to be fascinated by them, by the noise and the chatter. Blaise was his usual exuberant self, doing impressions of the legendary Dumbledore and releasing chocolate frogs to hop around the next cabin. Pansy's eyes never left Malfoy as she sat opposite him on the seat. She looked at his eyes, his hair, his mouth. Hermione knew infatuation when she saw it. She didn't ever see Malfoy look back at Pansy, though. Theo sat on her other side. He was quieter, mostly looking out through the window. When the train began to slow and Hogwarts loomed into view, the cabin hushed into a slightly awed silence. Most of their parents had attended Hogwarts. They had been waiting for their time to begin and to finally be 11. The excitement on the train was palpable. Hermione watched Malfoy and his friends all gather their belongings and elbow their way to the front of the train. It was never spoken out loud that Malfoy was the leader of their group. He just seemed to assume that role. He stood taller than everyone else, except Goyle, his face a picture of judgmental disdain as he looked down at the other students, his nose wrinkled as though there was a bad smell. Hagrid met them at the station and led them to the boats. Hermione felt positively nostalgic at revisiting what had been one of the most wonderful days of her life. It briefly lifted her spirits. The boat journeyed across the Black Lake was uneventful. Malfoy sat with Crabbe and Goyle, mesmerized as they all had been by the sight of Hogwarts looming out of the darkness. She and Blaise watched him as they entered the castle and stood at the bottom of the stairs, listening to Professor McGonagall explain how the sorting hat worked. Malfoy looked at Crabbe as she mentioned Slytherin House, smirking, but the smile left his face as soon as he turned his back around. She could see his great eyes scanning the room. They lit upon her fuzzy head again for a moment, widening slightly before sliding off her and onto Harry next to her. He physically jolted when he recognized him. Malfoy's eyes narrowed now as he took in Harry, running over his face, his hair, his scar. His eyes didn't leave Harry as McGonagall finished her speech and left. The second she was gone, he moved purposefully across the room. Crabbe and Goyle followed, ever the loyal lapdogs, totally in awe of Malfoy's self-important air. She watched him physically arrange his features into a smile, an attempt at looking friendly, she thought. But Malfoy had very little experience of friendliness, and it came off looking cruel, sly. "So it's true, then, what they were saying on the train?" His voice was tight, pompous, so different to how it had sounded when he was younger. "Harry Potter has come to Hogwarts." He affected to look casual, his hand resting on the banister, but one fist was tight at his side. At Malfoy's words, there was a hushed burst of speculation and chatter amongst the group of students. They all knew who Harry was, too. Draco indicated to his friends, "This is Crabbe, and this is Goyle." He looked uncomfortable then, unsure. "And I'm Malfoy, Draco Malfoy." At this, Ron, who had been standing next to Harry, sniggered. She saw the tips of Malfoy's ears turn pink, his jaw clenched, He turned on Ron, a nasty look in his eye. Think my name's funny, do you? No need to ask yours. Red hair and hand-me-down robes? You must be a Weasley. Hermione remembered how Ron looked at Malfoy then. It still hurt her to see it now. Malfoy turned to Harry, looking at him imploringly. This wasn't going to plan. She could see it in his eyes. He was floundering. He fell back on what his father had taught him, what he thought was important. He didn't know Harry, didn't know anything other than what had been forced down his throat since birth and would continue to be thrown down his throat until his early death at the age of 26. You'll find that some wizard families are better than others. You don't want to go making friends with the wrong sort. I can help you there. Hermione and Blaise watched as Malfoy extended one small, ever so slightly shaking hand out to Harry. They watched Harry's eyes move to the palm, following his eyes staring at him, willing him to take his hand. Harry's eyes narrowed in disdain. I think I can tell the wrong sort for myself, thanks. Harry's green eyes glared into Malfoy's gray ones. Ron stood next to him, his own shoulders tense. Hermione saw the flicker of emotion across Malfoy's indolent face, the brief moment of panic in his eyes, the small flinch as McGonagall tapped him on the shoulder with her scroll. The group moved away then. She saw herself, Ron, and Harry talking excitedly. Blaise had an arm slung around Theo's shoulders. Pansy was scowling around her. None of them saw Malfoy, stood as still as he had been petrified, his eyes still cast down onto his empty, outstretched hand. He looked frantic, panicked. He was frozen, unsure of what to do. He looked after Harry towards the back of their heads, moved slightly in their direction, and then stopped. He took a few calming breaths in and out. Then the walls came slamming down, and he was a Malfoy again. Cocksure, arrogant. His mask was back in place. The memory ended there, and Hermione and Blaise both pulled their faces out. Blaise was shaking his head, disbelieving. Hermione couldn't get the final expression on Malfoy's face out of her head. He knew, she realized, even then that he had failed on his promise to his father, fallen at the first hurdle, and it wasn't even day one.